They were the heroes from the future. Teenagers protecting the universe from those that would sow the seeds of chaos. Each had unique powers and abilities. And though they often had their differences, they came together to save the day as the Legion of Superheroes. Now, you can be a part of their adventures and learn the history of the future in the Legion Clubhouse.
It's the Legion Clubhouse 50th episode. Have you heard of Modulus?
Modulus, blah, space bile.
Adventure Comics number 376, The Execution of Chameleon Boy. Published January 1969. Written by Jim Shooter with art by Win Mortimer from Shooter Layout. A Legionnaire faces death in another dimension.
Matthew, this week only you can prevent the execution of Chameleon Boy.
I'm not sure I want to. That's what's really, really sad about adventure number 376. I'm like,
why?
Well, first of all, this, as I'm sure everyone listening knows, this is the second half of a big two-part extravaganza.
What the listeners don't know is that 2 weeks ago, they heard part one of this. But for us, it's been almost 2 months since we've sat down to record. So there's a lot of time in between these issues for the two of us. And maybe, 50 years ago, they kind of knew that. So they have this really weird, trippy intro page to kind of catch us up on what has happened before and what is to come in this issue.
But the thing that's fascinating about it is, first of all, I love the fourth wall breaking.
I found it so disconcerting.
I love it because the four Legionnaires who are narrating, or three Legionnaires who are narrating, are leaning on the panels.
Yeah.
With the flashbacks from last issue. And I've never seen anything like that. And it feels very weird and very meta. And I sort of like that. What I hate is that immediately after that, we go to Metropolis 2068.
Oh, 2068, you say? Isn't this supposed to take place like 2168 or 2368?
2968, 1,000 years in the future. This is actually either an alternate reality, and I'm going to go with alternate reality where the Legion exists 100 years in the future and sucks, as opposed to just a bad edition.
I think when someone was typing this script, they hit the 0 instead of the 9 because they're so close to one another. But the weird thing is, Matthew, you and I could conceivably live long enough to see this date roll up.
Given my ingestion of pork ribs and your dirty Sinestros, I'm going to go with it borderline because that's 49 years. We'd be in our 90s. We'd be like,
we'd be in the 90, 96, 97, 98. Yeah.
It is the 21st century and life expectancies are theoretically going up.
In the U.S., it's going down, actually.
Well, the U.S. may be a bad example.
Yes.
Let's talk about the civilized world. Yeah. But the thing that really irritates me about this issue is after last issue, which, if you have been listening, was the big debut of the Wanderers, the second greatest superhero team in the world. And it ended with Bouncing Boy proving that he is the greatest hero of the Legion. And this issue literally starts with 5 panels completely nerfing all the cool stuff that Bouncing Boy did. And they're like, oh, Bouncing Boy, you're such a goof. We only like you because your dad has a Camaro. It was clearly Chameleon Boy doing all the cool stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, how could it be Chameleon Boy? Chameleon Boy is down in the meta bay being checked out. Oh, wait, Prody 2.
Prody 2.
Yeah, so we spend, there is a 1-page, fourth wall, here's what's coming in this issue, then 2 pages of previously in the Legion.
Nobody knows what the last planet is.
3 pages almost.
Yeah.
And then they're like, wait a minute. The leader of the Guardians of the Galaxy, how did he know what was going on? It's because he had these 7 Stones of Wonder. Maybe if we use these 7 Stones of Wonder, we could figure out where the other Bouncing Boy really went.
And don't snap your fingers when you have all 7 stones, Ultra Boy.
So I think there's something going to be interesting, and this is a thread that listeners may have already picked up on in a couple of other episodes, but if not, I want you to put a pin right here in your memory castle.
Click.
And I want you to start thinking about, in less than a decade, Jim Shooter will have left DC and will be working over at Marvel. And in literally 10 years, he will be the editor-in-chief in Marvel. And I think what we're going to start seeing is not only some of Shooter's ideas that are presented in DC Comics suddenly becoming apparent over at Marvel, and I gag about it's a gag about the Guardians of the Galaxy, but if you think about those characters that were introduced last issue, they certainly seem Guardians of the Galaxy tropey, even though Guardians of the Galaxy were introduced before that last issue.
Ooh.
Or pretty close.
Yeah.
But here we have 7 stones, Matthew, 7 stones that do 7 different things.
Mm-hmm.
One is for the mind. One is for the mind. One is for the soul. One is for the time.
Right. One ring to bind them all.
Right. And in the darkness find them.
Yeah. But
so what are the chances that the Infinity Stones or the Infinity Gems or whatever that they're calling them these days,
right,
are actually a Shooter creation that first appeared here in Adventure Comics 376?
Well, the thing that's interesting about the Infinity Stones as we know them today, the first one appeared like 5 years before all the others in 72.
Right.
When the creature that had been known as him traveled to Counter-Earth and became Adam Warlock in the pages of Marvel Premiere #1. And I pronounce Premiere correctly because I enjoy a controversy as I am in no way British. But Premiere #1 had a soul gem, the soul gem actually. The rest of the gems didn't appear until 76, at which point Shooter is at Marvel.
Yeah, so the Mind Gem appeared in 75, the Power and Time Gems in 77. Yep. All of the gems appeared in Avengers Annual #7 in 1977, and then in the Infinity Gauntlet in 1990.
But Captain Marvel #45, which came out in 76, established that there were, at the time, they were calling them all soul gems.
Right.
That there were actually 6 of them and that they had different powers. And at this point in time, the editor-in-chief at Marvel was Marv Wolfman. But
but not for much longer, right?
No, Marv was only editor-in-chief for like a year and a half. But in a story written by Al Milgrom, we find out that there are multiple gems that do different things, and when you combine them, you become more powerful, which I'm not saying that this is something that Shooter himself bought, but I think that this is something that may be an influence.
Oh, sure. You mean, what we're seeing, you don't know about the power of the stones, Superboy? 3 of the stones are for revealing physical things, present, past, and future. 3 of them reveal unseen things like thoughts, emotions, and motives. The 7th stone reveals other dimensions.
And the thing is, they match so closely because the soul gem is all about manipulating your soul or the souls of the others. Mm-hmm. Time gem is time. The space gem is space. The mind gem enhances telepathic powers. The reality gem allows you to basically manipulate reality around you. And then the power gem, just turns you into He-Man.
There is another thing that is very interesting going on at this same time, or pretty close to this same time. And I don't know if it is due to poor pay that writers and artists are getting, but at this time, there is a somewhat free flow of information. Now, corporate would say, no, DC and Marvel shall never touch, and we are enemies. We are mortal enemies, even though for many years DC was the one that printed and released the Marvel comics. Right. But there was this, we're 2 separate entities, and yet the artists and the writers would often collaborate or talk with one another about the projects that were going on. And in some cases, when it comes to characters like Swamp Thing and Man Thing, weren't the creators there like roommates?
Yeah, Ween and Wolfman were roommates. And it's interesting because, they are separate companies, but you would see guys going back and forth between. There were people who worked for both companies at the same time. So if you look at, the creation of Len Wein's Swamp Thing in 72 and then Marv Wolfman's Man Thing later that same year, I'm not saying that they intentionally
Oh,
cross-pollinated, but I know that when Otter Disaster and I lived together back in the 1990s, he had to listen
cross-pollinating?
He had to listen to a lot of Pearl Jam and watch a lot of Power Rangers, and I actually know the name of the lead singer of Soundgarden. So, these are things that happen, whether you intend them to or not. And you have to ask yourself, of course, we talk about in the Major Spoilers podcast, one of our other shows, we did an entire show about the unofficial Halloween crossovers, the Rutland, Vermont Halloween shows.
Mm-hmm.
And those were all Roy Thomas and Marv Wolfman and Len Wein and his people. And I feel like it's one of those things where comics has always been a kind of a close-knit industry. There's like people who move around in comics. And if you worked in comics in the 70s, you probably knew all of these players. You certainly knew Jim Shooter. I think it may be one of those things where the Infinity Gems may have either been inspired by the Seven Stones of Galactus, or, which I think is more likely, there's an antecedent out there for both of them that we either don't realize or have never read.
Yeah, we may
and they're both referencing
connection.
The same thing.
It could be. It very well could be. I just find that interesting that, right at this time when Marvel and DC are really fighting with one another, and Marvel is emerging as this huge superpower in the comic publishing world, that we're seeing a lot of these influences, at least from my take, appearing first in DC and then suddenly being used over at Marvel. So we're not only going to see it here with these magical stones.
Yes.
We're also going to see it in the next issue we're going to talk about this week, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Secrets.
So we rejoin Bouncing Boy in the fifth dimension.
Already in progress. And Bouncing Boy Bouncing Chameleon transports across time, space, and dimension and lands in Game of Thrones.
Well, When Mortimer is the artist of this issue, is he not the one that I did not really care for? Because all the time in all of those crazy like 50s inspired fantasy Dungeons and Dragons issues, is he not the artist in those, or am I thinking of someone else?
I think if we're thinking about the same thing, and let's be honest, there are a lot of people that you've been like, I don't like this artist. I think we are thinking about Win Mortimer, because Win is a guy who does really interesting drapes and soft things and bits and pieces. And he did last issue where we saw the Wanderers, who, by the way, just disappear. Yeah.
So, okay, here's another thing that's going on. When Bouncy Boy shows up, we're in this high fantasy world that also has atomic axes and 3D TVs.
And this is my son Radagast and his brother Framistat.
But we are introduced to a whole cast of like space knights.
Yeah.
And
3 pages of story dedicated to introducing, this is my axe and I will throw it, and I possess a mighty mace, and look, my hat is invincible.
I have a theory about that. No, it's not bunnies, although it should always be bunnies. Right. With the last time, with what were they, the Wanderers?
The Wanderers.
With the Wanderers and now these Space Knights guys, I have a feeling that Jim Shooter was planting the seeds for these could be spin-off stories. Because we are in, like you said, 3 pages of what makes all of these guys fantastic, and look how great they are. And then when Kodar the Magnificent shows up, they just all vanish, and we don't see them anymore except for these 3 pages. And I really have a feeling that the idea was these could be potential spin-offs for DC. And Jim Shooter would be the creator for both of those. And when we look at Guardians of the Galaxy, or when we look at Space Knights, or what was the Atomic Knights? No, the Atomic Knights.
Those are earlier, yeah.
Yeah, I would think that there might be some connection there in that he's trying to create some spin-offs. We see through his writing and the fact that he's kind of in charge of these books that he's making Karate Kid second to Superman. In fact, when they're I think it's this issue or the next issue, when they're calling out names, it's Superboy and Karate Kid are the 2 named Legionnaires that pop right up when people are talking about the Legionnaires. And it's just really crazy. And I wonder if he wasn't trying to do that with these different sets of teams.
It's possible. I mean, if you were 18, 17, whatever Jim Shooter is at this point, and you were writing a major comic book, wouldn't you want to get your guys, I say in air quotes, the characters that you've created or the characters that you've been, playing with since you were 11, to get those into a real DC comic? Last issue we saw the Wanderers, and the Wanderers were interesting to me because when I started reading Legion in the 80s, around 84, 85, the Wanderers were one of those things that they were like a unicorn. they had appeared maybe 5 times, and every time it was like, these guys are secret awesome, and they're so secret awesome that they're doing all these awesome things you never saw. They're basically Boba Fett.
Boba Fett.
And they get their own Boba Fett. Where they get their own spinoff in '87, and what happens in the very first issue? They're all murdered.
Yep.
And this is really wonderful because we introduce the Knights of the Round Table, where you have Sir Mix-a-Lot and Sir Braille and Sir Bors and Sir Elfstar and Sir Galindo. Sergio Galindo, that's what his name is, and they literally never appear again.
Yeah, like I said, when the big bad shows up, Kodar, and when the battle begins, the only one that's there is the king fighting with his sonic pitchfork, and that's it. All the rest are gone by that point. So it's really weird and makes me again wonder: was this supposed to be a setup for something bigger? Was there, And we know that in a few years, Shooter's gone. He may have gotten fed up with, hey, I'm giving you all these guys great IPs, and you're not doing anything with them. For those screaming at your pods, Guardians of the Galaxy first appearance 1969. So Wanderers do predate the Guardians of the Galaxy by at least 2 years.
And remember, that's the 30th Century Guardians, who are not the same people as the movie Guardians. Not even a character in common. Right. With the exception of Yondu, who isn't the same Yondu. Yondu in 1969 was actually more of a space Amerindian guy with a flag on his head, as opposed to the space redneck we got in Guardians of the Galaxy TV show. So
I'm Mary Poppins, y'all.
I'm Mary Poppins. Oh, that's so touching. But anyway, back in the, I like to call it a Cinderreaper story, where Reap Daggle, Chameleon Boy,
says, wait a minute, I'm no longer Bouncing Boy. I'm this alien dude.
And they're like, oh my God, he's orange with pointy ears and antennae. And now we're going to kill him even more. Oh, Reap.
Oh, it is.
Buddy.
No, this gets really weird.
It does. It's a
suddenly,
solo story.
It is, but the thing is, once they see that he's an alien, everyone suddenly turns on him. And so the thing is, whoever can defeat Kodor gets my daughter's hand in marriage. And Vavavoom, she is hot stuffs all over the place, right?
Yeah, she's your basic Julie Newmar in a diaphanous gown kind of thing.
And Chameleon Boy falls in love with her, right? I mean, he's like, oh, I'm very smitten with her, and this world is crazy. It's got all these anachronisms. It's got, this medieval stuff, but also there's these 3D TVs hidden away right next to an atomic spinning wheel.
Right. Like you do.
And he falls in love with her. But then he goes before the council of the round circles.
Right.
And there is the king who says, there's a chance you might win in this battle, and I will not permit my daughter, Princess Elwinda, to marry an orange-skinned alien freak. And all of a sudden, I am just like, holy crap, this suddenly turned into a commentary about mixed race relations and miscegenation in a comic book. It's one throwaway line, because then Chameleon Boy has to fight Kodar and defeat him, and he does get permission to marry her. But holy crap, there's another event that's going on just a year prior to this that was a big Supreme Court case called Loving versus Virginia. And this is 1967 is when this was. This is a decision that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where, again, this might be surprising to many of you listening, but back in the 60s and prior to 67, and even shortly after 67, there were states that prohibited interracial marriage. These were miscegenation laws preventing white people from marrying black people mainly, but it also included any race. So today, my wife and I were married. My wife and I were born just a few years after the Loving versus Virginia case. Yep. And had that not changed, we would not be able to be married today.
Yep.
Even though there was the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, the anti-miscegenation laws prevented people from intermarrying. And I really think that there is a lot of Loving versus Virginia sitting on Jim Shooter's mind when he wrote that line in this book a year later.
I would not disagree with you, because it is clearly, the old school fantastic racism is we're going to treat this character differently, even though, in this case, he's a shape-shifting, pointy-eared orange dude. But we are going to try and, treat this as actual, discrimination, something that we can take and do the Star Trek expansion story. You're telling an adventure tale, but you're also saying something that has a larger perspective and it has ramifications. But I think that the weirdest part of this issue for me is the point where Cam is like, oh no, she's scared of me. I'm not a devil. And he turns into the devil.
Yeah. And he's like, I'm not a dragon. I'm not a devil.
I'm not a giant monster. Oh, wait, I can be. Want to see? He takes the time to try and calm her down by telling this woman, I'm not a dragon, while he turns into a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
That is stupid.
Yeah, he's trying to impress her and not scare her and everything. There's a couple of, I want to go back to the race relations and interracial marriage and romance and everything. Mm-hmm. If you look on the page where Chameleon Boy and Elwinda are kissing.
Edwina.
So this issue came out January of 1969. Mm-hmm. Okay. There was a very popular television show running. Well, I don't know how popular it was. It was canceled after 3 seasons.
It was relatively popular.
But Star Trek, the original series, was running in this exact same time period. And if you go and look at Plato's Stepchildren, this was first broadcast November 22nd, 1968. This is where Uhura and Captain Kirk share that kiss that really shook everyone up, right?
Yep.
If you go and look at just go to the wiki page, Kirk and Uhura's kiss, if you look at that is almost the exact same pose that we see here on this page.
Ooh, you think Jim's a Trek fan?
Well, yeah, I think we've mentioned this before, that I believe Jim Shooter was a very big Star Trek fan, because we've seen several other Star Trek references or influences pop up in this series. And if Mortimer is drawing these pages based on Shooter layouts, he very well could have remembered that scene and almost that exact same framing.
Yep.
And said, here, draw this.
And, this is the thing. You may be thinking at home, how many ways are there to draw a kiss? Well, 73. But this is intentionally very similar. And I agree with Stephen on this one. I believe that this is designed to echo the Kirk Uhura kiss, because it's even the same sort of framing. It's a tight shot from the bottom of her chin to the top of his head. And
the angle and everything.
To the right. He's turning left. The only real difference is that his hand is in frame on the Star Trek version, and her hand is in frame, as we see here in these pencils. And yeah, I agree with you. That's a legit reference.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. But Chameleon Boy says, you know what? I'm going to go and fight this guy. And they're like, no, we can't have this interspecies. He says he's human, which we talked about this before. So they lock him away. And then, of course, Kodar attacks and wipes out the Knights of the Partial Circle. And I like
the Knights of the End Table.
I like how everyone has the initials of their king on their shields. Like Kodar's army has these square shields with the K on it, and Alderak's army has the round shields with the A on them.
Sure, like they do.
Yeah, I guess. I also like that they're riding carnival ride atomic-powered horses to go into battle. Predating Joust by I don't know how many years.
Probably 20. I think Joust was 84 or 85.
But anyway, Chameleon Boy, cell is damaged, so he escapes, and he's like, I don't care what happens. I'm taking Kodar down, and single-handedly smashes the bejeebus out of a Kodar. And the king is like, hooray, you may marry my daughter. And he's like, okay, I certainly want to, because I'm in love with her. And of course, she's got that weird skirt that completely covers one leg, but completely shows
William
the other
T.
leg.
Skirt. It's that skirt that, somehow a little bit of titillation is even sexier than a girl who's naked. That's what it is. This is a Star Trek reference again.
I guess.
And then he says, and this is the thing, I want you to know that he says this straight-faced. He's like, we'll perform the ceremony here on the field of honor. And Chameleon Boy's like, okay, what do I do? We cut to Chameleon Boy with his head on a chopping block and 2 guys with giant axes. And Chameleon Boy thinks, what a strange ritual. And I think there is a probably more than 0 and less than 50% chance that this is actually King Artros about to murder you, Cam.
I don't think so.
I think so. I believe that this is how you execute the strange orange boy, and then you can just be like, "Oops, sorry, I goofed. Bummer."
At least they didn't keep it with Bouncing Boy and say, "Oh, I won't allow some fat kid to marry my daughter." At least they didn't go that way, which they could have.
But then if you had hit Bouncing Boy in the neck, it would just go boing, and it'd come right back and hit you in the face, and it would be like
about the time they were performing this marriage ceremony, the legionnaires finally tune into the right frequency, and they're able to see where Chameleon Boy is at. They see what appears to be him about to be beheaded, and they use a experimental teleport ray, which I thought they already had. What's his name's teleport cube?
I
guess that's a time cube.
Ray.
Okay,
that's a cube. This is a ray.
Yeah, so they pull the switch, and Chameleon Boy is transferred, and you stupid meddling idiots, you've ruined everything.
How dare you save me from certain death? I guess it's midnight, and my coach turned into a pumpkin.
And he just wanders away into the night.
Wah, wah, wah. And you hear the Hulk piano theme.
Which, again, wouldn't be out for another, almost 10 years.
Yeah, but it's another shooter connection.
There you go. So what did you think of this issue? I thought this was really kind of a downer of an ending, and it makes me wonder if Chameleon Boy, the lifelong bachelor of the group, is
pining for the fjord.
If he continues to have these feelings for her years from now, or even issues from now, on this long lost love of his.
I believe that Princess Elwinda is forgotten immediately, and I think that the best part of this issue is the fact that it reminds us that these characters are meant to be teenagers, because he falls in love in the space of 14 panels. And it's just like, this is the deepest thing I've ever felt, you guys. We've all been there. I mean, we were 16, 17 years old once. And I like that aspect of it. And I kind of like the idea of a solo Legion story. But I don't like this either as a solo issue or as the second part of the big cliffhanger last issue, because literally everything from last issue is dropped so that we can go off to, the planet of the Game of Thrones and do this weird solo story in the medieval times restaurant of 30,063. I am not a fan of this issue.
Yeah, this isn't the first time that we've seen issues do that, or stories do that, where part 2 is radically different from part 1.
Right. Part 2 is just something completely different. And part of the disappointment is that I really liked the idea of another, not necessarily even competing, just another superhero outfit, the Wanderers being out there. And you're like, yeah, okay, they're there. It's fine. They do their thing. This is why the Legion doesn't always have to fight all the battles themselves. But the Wanderers got hosed. I mean, they're like, hey, we sure are awesome. 2 of us get introductions, and then we're just going to sort of slide off the end of the pier, and we'll be back in 20 years. Bye. I just, ugh.
Yeah. I thought it was okay. I thought it was kind of a downer of an ending. I thought the reveal was weird. I thought spending 3 pages telling us what happened in the last issue was rather excessive.
Especially when you look at the fact that, there's only 24 story pages.
And I really don't like Space Knights. I really don't. I really don't. That is a thing that is a holdover from the 1950s that should not be in a comic book in 1968.
And it certainly shouldn't be in a comic book that's ostensibly set in the future. This is not the first, nor the second, or even the third time we've seen medieval times in the Legion of Superheroes.
Yeah, and I'm sure it won't be the last either.
Oh, it won't. Projectra comes from planet medieval times. Remember that.
Yeah.
We'll go back there many times and we'll be like, hey, look, it's 1652.
If you enjoy the show, we would appreciate your support. You can find out more and become a Legion Clubhouse member at patreon.com/majorspoilers. Adventure Comics number 377, Heroes for Hire. Published February 1969, written by Jim Shooter with art by Win Mortimer from Shooter Layouts. Why are the Legionnaires insisting they get paid before saving lives?
So I mentioned that there was going to be another Shooter Marvel connection, and it comes in Adventure Comics 377, where the title of this issue is Heroes for Hire.
What?
So, Matthew, who are the Heroes for Hire?
Well, there have actually been several different iterations, but the original iteration of the Heroes for Hire at Marvel Comics started in 1978.
Mm-hmm.
8?
Power Man and Iron Fist number 54.
Essentially, what you're looking at are two characters who were holdovers from earlier fads. Luke Cage, who spun out of blaxploitation films of the early 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your Dolomites and your Black Belt Jones, and Iron Fist, who spun out of the Kung Fu
martial arts Kung Fu craze, yeah.
Yeah, and both of them were kind of running their course by 1975, and so they're like, hey, let's put them together. So they put them together, and they became Power Man and Iron Fist together, and went another decade or half decade. So, yeah, the original Heroes for Hire were Power Man and Iron Fist. I guess technically Luke was the hero for hire all the way back in his first issue in 1973, but let's not go there for now.
But the key point for the Heroes for Hire is they have a corporation called Heroes for Hire Inc. That was when it was founded in Power Man and Iron Fist number 54, where they basically go out and do deeds based on people paying them a fee.
Yep. You pay us a nice fee. And when Luke Cage started out, it was kind of a take on the old, 30s detectives, $25 a day plus $6 for expenses. And with the Heroes for Hire, as they transitioned into the 80s, what we saw more often than not was them not getting paid,
right,
or refusing funds. That thing where it's like, well, I'm a little kid and my dad's a jerk, and I was wondering you'd put him in jail. Sure, we'll do it for free.
So I know, dear listener, you're saying, Stephen, I know that's, the title of this comic has nothing to do with Luke Cage and Danny Rand doing their thing, because Legionnaires would not take money to go and do good deeds. Oh, but dear listener, wait until you find out about the planet Modos and the guy on there called Modulus. Modulus. So there's a planet, which I guess is a living planet, which I didn't look up Mogo.
Mogo is different. But
I know, but when did Mogo appear?
1982, I want to say.
Modo, a sentient planet.
Yes.
Predates Mogo.
A differently sentient planet. Yes.
By many, many years.
Yeah. Mogo, the Green Lantern, was a backup story in Tales of the Green Lanterns back when Alan Moore was first cutting his teeth in American comics.
That's a really good story. If you haven't read the Mogo story, it's really good.
That original Mogo story is amazing, and I want you to understand something very important. There were no other Mogo stories.
No, there weren't. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there was a Batman, I think it was a Batman team-up animated series where they actually did the retelling of the Mogo story.
They actually, I think they've blown him up several times.
Oh, they have.
In the endless wars of Green Lantern.
I just find it interesting that we have a sentient planet called Modo, which has a guy on there called Modulus, which is protecting criminals who make it to the planet. So it's basically impossible for the police, the United Planets Space Science Police, to get there. It's impossible for the Legionnaires to get there. Yep. And the Legionnaires are like, well, I guess since we can't stop these criminals, we might as well go into business for ourselves. And your baby's about ready to fall off of a building. You better pay me, or I'm going to let that baby die. Your rocket ship's about to crash into the ocean. You better pay us, or you're all going to die. And they do that. And of course, then we get the Fox News people popping on saying, there's something that's got to be done about these Legionnaires.
Yeah, those rotten kids. How are you?
Is this not the second time that we get an appearance by Leland McCauley III?
It is. Leland McCauley III, who is the rival Quantrill,
the second richest man in the universe.
Yeah, and hates being the second, I might add. But McCauley in this issue pops up, and the Legion are like, hey, if you want us to do deeds for you, you should pay us, see? I like the fact that McCauley pops up. I feel like those little touches of continuity are some of the positive things about the shooter era. It's not all, here's a guy in this issue, and then 6 months later, a guy who literally serves the exact same role, but is a completely different guy shows up. I like that. I hate Macaulay.
Oh, yeah. No, I think he's supposed to be somebody that you don't like, so that when he gets robbed by Superboy, not robbed, when he has to pay to have his rocket ship saved by Superboy.
When he gets extorted by Superboy.
We can say extortion. There's a lot of that going on in this issue. It also has some crazy drug trippy moments where Brainiac gets inundated with some Preparation L, which I guess is the natural evolution of Preparation H.
And it really messes him up. It turns him into like a Robbie Benson movie.
This is not the first time that we've seen Brainiac on a drug trip like this. There's a couple of episodes ago, I mentioned that Brainiac is having what I call a vertigo moment. And he looks just like a young Jimmy Stewart. And it's almost like the exact same as the sequences here, except we're seeing the Summer of Love colors taking over this comic.
Oh, man, it is some serious psychobilly freakout moments here. And I feel like, and I don't want this to sound terrible because I do enjoy Win Mortimer. I feel like if this was a Kurt Swan layout, it would be less generic. Because it is 1968 or early 69 when this comic comes out. Mm-hmm. And you're just like, I'm Brainiac 5. Oh, my God. I'm trapped in a Robbie Benson film. Oh, my God. But I don't know.
Well,
we've seen these types of layouts in comics.
And in fact, when in the last issue, when Bouncing Boy was being transported to Fantasy Planet, there's also a panel like that using the same color scheme and the same trippy swirls as he's being transported.
Oh,
yeah. Now, here's the thing that I'm thinking. If you look at the other characters that are trapped in this, you see the silhouette of Karate Kid and you see Duo Damsel also trapped in this gas or getting a dose of Preparation L. Later in the episode, they keep making references to has Duo Damsel checked in? Where's Karate Kid? Or, have they completed these missions? And for some reason, and this might be a really good swerve in this, I thought the entirety of this issue was going to be a Brainiac-induced drug trip.
That would have been
where he has to confront his fear of what happens if we cannot protect people from the criminals. What happens if we become the criminals ourselves?
That would have been better than what we got.
But that's not what we get, unfortunately.
No.
It would have actually, I think, been a lot better. But I must say, the Science Police, they have the scariest machine in the world with the Interrogator.
Interrogator.
Now read this as a 2001 HAL voice. I am the Interrogator. My ultra-sensitive probes reveal your innermost thoughts. You cannot deceive me. My truth value indicator prohibits it. Now your name. Tell me about your origin. Your cohorts. Remember, your cooperation will be rewarded. And then also read it as Colossus.
Oh, from the Forbin Project?
From the Forbin Project. And it becomes really chilling. I mean, it's this giant eye staring down at this criminal that they've caught. And he's just telling them the whole thing about Modo and the entire planet, about how no one can do anything. And so then the Legion go into hiding for a couple of weeks.
Now imagine it as my answering machine from 1986.
I am the Interrogator.
That's not an answering machine. That's Whopper with cheese.
My ultra-sensitive probes reveal your innermost thoughts. There's one
more thing that I think this issue really missed out on.
How so?
When the Legionnaires go into their new Legion headquarters and they sequestered themselves for a couple of weeks, there's two dudes standing around talking on the outside.
Right.
This would have been perfect if they would have used the same two dudes from when the new Legion Clubhouse was being built and they're talking about how much money it cost. And if it had been the same two dudes that were standing outside the Robo News dispenser, it's almost like they could have used these two guys as these reoccurring characters that are always making the social commentary.
Right.
But they missed out on that chance to do that. And I kind of am, in hindsight, kind of super disappointed that they didn't keep that gag going.
You know, those guys could be even called Frank and Ernest, and you just have them out there going, hey, did you hear the thing about the Legion? Where do you hear these rumors?
Yeah, exactly.
Just around.
So the rest of the issue is nothing more than the Legionnaires going out on missions and telling people, hey, you have to pay if you want us to do this stuff. We don't care if everyone hates us, but we're going after. And it seems they're going after some very weird things. Like one planet has these like crystal turtles that eat everything. And then there's another planet where they have radiated metals are the
radioactive. It's basically the monies of many worlds.
Yeah. And it's really weird and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And suddenly the Legionnaires, or at least Karate Kid and Princess Projectra, go on a shopping spree. And that gives the bad guys, the thieves, a chance to go rob the Legion rocket ship, which they have, left the Earth and are now traveling around in space in this rocket ship where they're accumulating their mass wealth. And so then the bad guys go and say, we're going to go rob that spaceship. And then when
the one with Legion painted on the side.
And then when the Legion ship crashes or lands in the on Moto, Chemical King shows up. And he starts transforming some of the things to let the turtles out, which then start eating some of the money, which then release a bunch of gas, which then knocks over the mirror, which then allows this reflector beam to be hit, which suddenly blinds everyone. And the gas of all of these metals and excrements combined creates a gas that knocks out all of the bad guys on the planet, including the mighty Modulus
himself.
And then everyone
could go.
Mousetrap
when you were a kid?
No, because I could never get the damn thing to work.
Right. That's the thing about this. This is Rube Goldberg device.
Oh, yeah. This really is. It's really far-fetched, and you really have to suspension of disbelief here. I mean, beyond the fact that these are teenagers and they're putting their life in jeopardy, and this is taking place in the future, and there's a living sentient planet, suspension of disbelief, Matthew.
Right. And, this issue does also have one thing that puzzles me at the end, because they're like, oh, well, our plan worked. We'll just have to pay back the money that we took using our own pockets. And I'm like, okay, first, one of two things is about to happen here. Either RJ Brand is about to get a huge bill, or the Legionnaires are digging into their own savings.
I don't think they're digging into their own savings. I took it as the Legion organization needs to go and repay that money. And to be honest,
this sounds like embezzlement. This sounds like when Bruce Wayne steals money from Wayne Industries.
How do you think RJ Brand became the richest guy in the entire universe?
In an ethical manner, Stephen. You do not mock RJ Brand. He's the sweetest, kindest, most warm, caring individual I've ever met.
But the point remains is, I think that the amount of money that they took, while it may seem like a lot because they have a lot of things, it's probably easily replaceable. It's not like they accumulated $50 billion. They probably had maybe a total of maybe $1 million. And for RJ Brand, that's like an afternoon at tea.
Well, Projectra is the princess of an entire planet.
Yeah, she can just make people think that they have the money back.
Brainiac is upper crust of Kolu. I mean, a Brainiac is a high level, like a prince or an earl. He'd be like a kick-ass duke. But you have characters like Karate Kid, who grew up penniless in Tokyo, and Superboy, who's from the middle of Kansas, and Chemical King, who never has any depth or character really to speak of. But it's nice to see him get some airtime. He's been a Legionnaire for 4 or 5 issues, and I think this is the first time he's had a line.
You think? I don't think so. I think this is not such a big deal.
I like Chemical King here. I like the fact that the Princess Projector refers to him as CK. Yeah. CK. And then to Duo Damsel as DD. Because her name is Princess Projector, so you can just call her PP.
Yeah, I don't think that works. Yeah,
PP.
So there's another interesting thing before we close out this episode. This was you really have to have a stretch of imagination. So I was not a big fan of this story. I mean, it's interesting to see how they really put all their brains together and came up with this plan with the hopes that everything would trigger in the right order.
Right.
But it was really kind of a, okay kind of story for me. The most interesting thing was, Heroes for Hire? That's interesting. Jim Shooter came up with this idea, and then he was EIC at Marvel when Heroes for Hire were named. That's very fascinating. I wonder if we will see more of this in the future.
Maybe.
I think we will. What are your thoughts on this issue, Matthew?
I think the most fascinating part of this issue for me was the fact that it's one of the issues that has DC's circulation figures.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I wanted to get to, was that a lot of times we're wondering what are actual numbers? How are comics being sold in this day and age? Yep. And one of the things that was a requirement for getting media mail or magazine mail subscription rates through the post office was that you had to print your actual amount shipped, or your actual publications at least once a year.
Ownership and circulation once every year. So
at least once a year. Sometimes we see this pop up 4 times a year, but then that would set the rates for your postal rates for the next year, or for the next quarter, or whatever that may be.
Yep. And this is interesting because this is 1968. So DC printed 697,000 copies of average of Adventure Comics in 1968. Of those, paid circulation, meaning sales through like people who had subscriptions and stores and dealers, 409,000. 2,200 of them were mail subscriptions. So there were 2,200 people getting Adventure Comics by mail every month, flat packed. So you had to fold it yourself and ruin your comic book. But this is interesting to me. They even break down like 400 copies that were given away free, and then total distribution, and 285,000 issues were considered leftover, for a total of like 697,000, 700,000 issues. But that's like 300,000 leftover comics that weren't sold, and on average every month in 1968. That is so weird.
I didn't know that you wanted to talk about this before recording, because I would have brought it up to you. But in one of the history of comic books that I have, it actually talks about how there may have been like a mob influence in this distribution, and how oftentimes there were warehouses of comics. And this also happened in the record industry as well. This is how they inflated the record industry.
Right.
They would have warehouses of just records and comic books and other things to overinflate how many items that were sold, how many that were in circulation, etc. And then they just dump them all in the river.
Wow.
Now, I'm not saying that DC was involved in this, but in one of the history of comics books that I have, they do talk about how there were some ne'er-do-wells that showed up to Marvel offices one day trying to, sure, it would be a bad thing if something happened to your comic book collection here. And I can't remember if it was Kirby or someone else who wanted to just take them on right then and there. And, at one point there's a story of someone called and said, hey, you haven't paid this much in the circulation. They were adding them up and said, well, we didn't even print that many copies. And another guy was like, no, don't worry about it. Don't mess with these guys. Don't question these guys. Just pay them.
Wow.
Yeah. I'll have to go back and look up that story and maybe share it in another place, maybe in the show notes for this episode, if I remember. But cool. Yeah, to have 300,000 leftover comics at this time is very fascinating. 411 paid subscriptions, which are going out in, as the mailers are going out to the grocery stores. You know what else happens to those 300,000 leftovers, Matthew?
What's that?
Well, they get sent out in a trash bin if they get thrown away, and kids go through and they pick them up. And they sell them for a nickel instead of 25 cents or whatever the cover price was at the time. And we start seeing the rise of the secondary market of comic books. And this is the point where, especially in the late 60s, we start to see the rise of the direct market comic book store.
Yep. And we've talked about this, I think, previously on this show, but I know on the Major Spoilers podcast.
Yes.
You also can't forget the phenomenon of stripped books, where in order to get credit for your Adventure Comics, all you had to do was rip off the logos and mail them back to your distributor.
Or rip off the entire cover. I remember as a kid, my mom somebody dropped off a whole box, like a huge box. There must have been about 100 comics in this thing.
Yep.
Of comic books without covers, because she was going to use them in the classroom. Kids could come up for craft projects or read them or whatever. Right. And I remember going through and finding, Superman comics and Justice League comics and all this stuff. And I could never figure out why there were no covers on these, because I didn't know that was the process of how you got credit for your comics instead of sending the whole thing back and paying that horrific shipping cost.
Yep. In the 60s and 70s, and I still have a bunch of these books in my collection because I bought them not knowing what they were. You tear off that top part with the logo. Mm-hmm. So I have a huge batch of comics that were clearly stripped and stolen. They just ripped off the top third. So you have 2/3 of the cover. That's actually the first place I ever saw the 3D Man. One of my favorite characters is I have a stripped comic of Marvel Premiere number 36. So it's one of those weird moments where you're just like, hey, how much of this is really going on when your average number of issues created, 740,000 throughout 1968. That just seems ridiculous at a time when 30,000 comics is considered a good seller.
Yeah, well, today the highest level, the highest selling comics on an average month, providing this isn't a number one or a special event comics, maybe 110,000.
Yeah.
So they were throwing away more comics in 1969 than the top sellers of today.
And Adventure Comics is not even a top tier title at this point.
Yeah, Uncle Scrooge is selling 1 million comics at this point.
Yeah, this is very interesting to me just to look at where are these books now, man? Oh, right. They're all in our hands.
That wraps it up for this installment of the Legion Clubhouse. Matthew, what did we learn this week?
We learned that Jack Nicholson may be scary, but the Kubrick stare of Clark Kent is even more terrifying. Here's Soupy!
I think we also learned that space fantasy is a big no-no.
And we learned that Cosmo Jetmobile, which I think is Kramer's real name, is an actual car model in the year 2068, which is somehow 900 years earlier than it should be.
Again, thank you for listening to this episode of the Legion Clubhouse. We appreciate all of you who give us a listen and share your thoughts on the iTunes or over at majorspoilers.com. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to see it continue, we would certainly appreciate your support. So head on over to patreon.com/majorspoilers. Find out how you can help us and keep this show going far into the future. Until the next time, when we once again hold a meeting of the Legion Clubhouse, I'm Don't Do Dope Boy.
And I'm Palindrome Lad Dal Imadralip.
The Legion Clubhouse is a production of Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC, and is produced by Steven Schleicher. Your hosts were Matthew Peterson and Steven Schleicher. You can follow Matthew at Mighty King Cobra and Steven at Major Spoilers. You can follow this podcast on Twitter at Legion Clubhouse. If you have questions or comments, send them to podcast@majorspoilers.com. I'm Jason Inman. Until next time, eat it, Grandpa.
This podcast is copyright 2019 by Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC.